Montana Territory, late October, 1877, rain hammered the cabin roof like a fist looking for a fight when she knocked. Rhett Foster had just set his rifle down by the hearth and was scraping the last of the ash from the firebox when the sound came sharp, urgent, and nothing like the wind. He stood, heart thudding, and crossed to the door. He opened it and the cold rushed in with her. A woman, soaked to the bone, clutched a bundled child against her chest. Her dress was muddy from the hem to her knees, her bonnet sagging with water. She looked up at him, eyes wide and bloodshot. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "My baby's burning up." Rhett stepped aside without a word. She staggered in, holding the child so close it looked like part of her. He shut the door behind her, bolting it as the wind howled. "Sit by the fire," he said, already pulling a dry blanket from the trunk near the wall. "Here." She sank to her knees by the hearth, unwrapping the child with shaking hands. "Her name's Sadie," she whispered. "She's 2. Fever came on yesterday. I tried to ride into town, but the trail washed out. Then my horse fell. I walked the last few miles." Rhett crouched beside her, eyes scanning the flushed little face, the too rapid breathing, the damp curls stuck to her forehead. "You the only ones?" he asked. She nodded. "My husband died last spring. Snake bite. We have or had a homestead about 10 miles east. Name's Kenzie Whitlow." Her voice trembled with exhaustion, but she met his eyes. Her strength was quiet, the kind that came from surviving when there was no choice. Rhett did not ask questions she had already answered. He moved fast, heating water, grabbing the willow bark and peppermint leaves he kept for illness, and soaking strips of cloth to lay on the girl's chest and neck. Kenzie held Sadie the whole time, murmuring softly to her even when her lips trembled and her eyes filled with helpless tears. Rhett had not let a woman inside this cabin since his sister died 3 winters ago. But there was no room for hesitation now. "She needs rest," he said as Sadie's breathing calmed, the fever dulled by the herbs and water. "And food. I have broth." Kenzie nodded, her arms still wrapped around the child. "Thank you, there was no one else." He looked at her then, really looked. Her face was pale, sharp from hunger, but her jaw was set with the same grit that had brought her to his door in the middle of a storm. She was young, 25 maybe, but her eyes looked older. "You found the right door," he said quietly. Kenzie leaned back against the wall, settling Sadie in her lap. The little girl whimpered once, then went still, her cheek pressed against her mother's chest. Rhett moved quietly around the cabin, setting another log on the fire and pouring the broth into a tin cup. He handed it to Kenzie, who sipped it slowly, her eyes never leaving Sadie. "Storm's not letting up tonight," he said. "You 2 stay as long as you need." She nodded, too tired for words. Later, when the wind screamed louder and the fire had burned low, Rhett laid a pallet near the hearth. Kenzie laid Sadie down gently and sat beside her, one hand on the child's back. Rhett gave her a pillow and another blanket. She looked up at him. "I do not know how I'll repay you." "You do not need to," he said simply. Kenzie stared at him for a long moment. "Most men would not help a stranger." "I am not most men." She smiled faintly and her face softened in the firelight. The lines of worry did not vanish, but they eased. Rhett turned away and stoked the fire. But even as he did, he felt her eyes on him, and he knew something had shifted. Not just in the cabin, but in him. The next morning brought a brittle kind of brightness, clouds broken, snow beginning to dust the pine outside. Sadie's fever had lowered. She still coughed, but it was not the frantic, rattling sound of the night before. Rhett built up the fire, boiled more water, and cooked a pot of oats with dried apples. Kenzie helped feed Sadie, coaxing her with soft words and a wooden spoon. Rhett watched her from the table, his coffee cooling in his hands. She noticed. "You are quiet." "I do not talk much," he said. "That is not a bad thing." She smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. Rhett looked at her, really looked, and saw the strength in her posture, the steadiness in her hands despite all she had been through. And for the first time in years, something warm stirred inside him. He stood and cleared his throat. "I need to check the traps. Should not be gone more than an hour. You will be all right here?" Kenzie nodded. "We will be fine." When he returned, he found her humming low to Sadie, who had curled up with one of his old flannel shirts. The warmth in the room was not just from the fire anymore. That night, as snow began to fall in earnest, Kenzie sat on the floor beside him, her legs tucked beneath her, her hair loose from its braid. "Thank you," she said again, her voice softer this time. "You saved her life." "I know it." Rhett stared into the fire. "She is your life," Kenzie looked at him. "You risked everything, letting strangers in. You did not have to," he met her eyes. "Yes, I did." She blinked, and a tear slipped down her cheek. He reached out slowly and brushed it away with the back of his fingers. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm quieted to a gentle hush. Inside, something warmer settled between them, something unspoken but real. And for the first time in a long while, Rhett Foster hoped. The snow had thickened by morning, blanketing the trees like silence made visible. Rhett shoveled a narrow path from the cabin to the lean-to, boots crunching in the new powder. Kenzie stayed inside with Sadie, who had started to rouse enough to fuss when the spoon paused between bites. Her cough clung, but her eyes were clearer, tracking the light through the window. By the time Rhett came back in, cheeks flushed from cold, Kenzie had her sleeves rolled and was wringing out a rag in the basin. Eyes narrowed in concentration. "You planning to take over my place?" he asked, setting down the kindling. "No," she said, wringing the cloth tighter, "but I can carry my weight." He dusted snow from his hat and leaned it on the peg, not saying you can't. She didn't look up. "I know what it means to owe too much." Rhett set the kettle back over the fire. "And I'm not the sort to count favors." Her shoulders dropped just slightly. He stepped beside her and reached for the cloth. "Let me show you how I use the elderflower. Works better with the steam." She moved aside to make room, and for a moment their arms touched. Her skin was cold from water, but her nearness brought something steady to the air between them. He showed her how to crush the dried blossoms into the steaming water, and she leaned in close enough for her breath to fog the rim of the basin. "Where'd you learn this?" she asked. "My sister," he said. "She had lungs like wet paper growing up. Learned what we could to keep her breathing." Kenzie dipped the cloth again, slower this time. "She pass," he nodded once. "Winter took her, 4 years ago." The only sound for a long while was the soft splash of water and the pop of pine sap in the flames. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked. "Going somewhere easier?" He shook his head. "There's no easy, just different kinds of hard." She gave a short breath, not quite a laugh. "Ain't that the truth?" Rhett stood and ladled the elderflower mixture into a cup for her. She warmed her hands on it before sipping. Sadie stirred on the cot, coughing shallowly. Kenzie crossed to her, the cup still in hand, and sat beside her, brushing the girl's hair back. "She's stronger than she looks," Rhett said. Kenzie looked up. "She gets that from her pa." He was stubborn enough to argue with lightning. He sat on the stool near the fire. "You miss him." She didn't answer right away. "I miss the life we were building, the part we never got to finish." Rhett nodded. "That's the part that sticks." Later, when Sadie was sleeping again, Kenzie stepped outside to fetch more snow for water. Rhett watched from the doorway, arms crossed, as she moved through the white with careful steps, her skirts lifted just enough to keep the hem from dragging. She returned with the pail full and cheeks wind stung. "Sky's clearing some," she said, glancing upward. "Could be sun tomorrow." "Could be," he agreed. "Still, that road's going to stay bad a while. I'll need to get back to the homestead eventually. I've got winter stores in the cellar and a few chickens if the foxes haven't taken him." "You planning to stay on alone?" She set the pail down. "It's what I've got." He didn't press her. Instead, he opened the cupboard and pulled out the last of the dried cornmeal. "I can make pone," he said. "Could use your help." She came to stand beside him, tying her hair back with a strip of cloth. "Hope you don't mind if I do it my way. I wouldn't have asked if I did." They worked side by side, hands brushing now and again. Her touch was sure, the kind that came from years of doing with little but making enough. When the bread was baking and the cabin filled with the scent of wood smoke and meal, Rhett glanced over at her. "You ever think about not going back?" he asked. She looked at him, eyes unreadable. You offering something else?" He didn't answer right away, just held her gaze. "Something to think on," he said finally. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "I'll think on it." He nodded once. That was enough. Outside, the wind had quieted. Inside, the warmth held. By the third morning, frost clung silver to the window glass, and the slope behind the cabin wore a thin crust of white that crunched beneath boots. Rhett stepped outside early, not for the traps this time, but to clear the roof. The snow had drifted high along the north edge, heavy enough to buckle old pine slats if left too long. He worked in silence, muscles tight beneath his shirt, the steady scrape of the shovel marking time. Inside the cabin, Kenzie stirred the coals back to life. She moved with more ease now, her hands no longer trembling from cold or hunger. Sadie had eaten a full bowl of oats at dawn, then fallen asleep again with her cheek pressed to Rhett's flannel-covered shoulder, where she'd wandered half awake while Kenzie dressed. When Rhett came back in, brushing snow from his sleeves, he found Kenzie kneeling near the hearth, sorting the few potatoes they had left. "You've got a spade?" she asked without looking up, "in the lean-to." "I want to dig out a bed for carrots if the ground hasn't frozen through yet." "Your soil's better than what I've got. I can tell by how your kindling splits." He leaned his hip against the doorframe. "You planning to start a garden here?" "I'm not planning anything." She glanced up. "But I don't like waiting around with idle hands." Rhett folded his arms. "You always work when you're worried. It keeps my thoughts from turning on me." He nodded once, then stepped forward, unlatching the crate by the wall. "I've got seed potatoes from the last crop, not much, but enough for a start." She took one, turning it over in her palm. "You saved more than just food here." "I save what I can." Kenzie stood, brushing off her skirt. "Well, if I'm still here when the thaw comes, maybe I'll help plant," if she held his eyes. "I don't want to stay somewhere out of gratitude." "I wouldn't want that either." He pulled a chair out for her. She sat without hesitation now, the space between them grown familiar in its own quiet way. Sadie stirred on the cot, her cough lighter than before. Kenzie rose and tucked the quilt closer around her. "She slept through the night," Rhett said. Kenzie nodded. "She hasn't done that since before her fever came on." Outside, the wind had settled to a whisper. Rhett poured water into the basin and set it over the fire. "I've got a plan," he said without looking at her. She waited. "There's a cabin 2 miles west abandoned, but the frame's good. Roof needs patching, stoves rusted out, but the land around it's flat, good for crops. It's yours if you want it, I'll help fix it." She stepped back slightly. "Why not just ask me to stay here?" "Because I figure you'd rather have your own roof." Kenzie studied him. "You don't think I'd mind sharing? I think you'd want the choice." She didn't answer right away. Just walked toward the window, watching the light shift across the snow. "I've made too many choices with no say in them," she said at last. "I married young because my father arranged it. I followed my husband west because he asked. I stayed after he died because I didn't know where else to go." She turned back to him. "But I came to your door because I chose to." Rhett met her gaze. "And you're welcome here however long you choose to stay." She stepped closer. "If I fix up that cabin, if I take that land, it won't be because I want distance. I know. I just need to know I can stand on my own feet again. You already are." Her jaw softened, and her hand brushed his where it rested on the table. He didn't move away. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Neither are you." The kettle began to whistle, but neither of them turned toward it. Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long, warm light across the wall. Kenzie let her hand linger on his a moment longer, then turned to tend the stove. Rhett watched her move, steady and sure, not out of obligation, but something else that had started to root between them, quiet and real, like spring beneath snow. The following week brought a brittle calm to the land. Snow crusted over but didn't deepen, and the sky stayed a pale, uncommitted gray. Rhett and Kenzie worked without discussion most mornings, he chopping wood, she boiling roots or darning the cuffs of his only wool shirt with thread pulled from an old hem. It wasn't silence for lack of words, but the kind that made room for thought. Kenzie had started measuring the days by Sadie's laughter, which had returned in fits, small and sudden, like a bird startled from brush. She was still weak, but each hour brought more color to her cheeks, and her legs had found strength enough to toddle from hearth to cot and back again, dragging Rhett's old tin cup along as a toy. One afternoon, Rhett came in from the lean-to with his sleeves rolled and 2 lengths of pine beam balanced on his shoulder. Kenzie looked up from the floor, where she was sewing a narrow strip of cloth into a sling to carry Sadie on her hip. "You planning to build something? Fix the overhang on the west side," he said, setting the beams down by the door. "Water pools there when the snow melts, could rot through if I don't brace it." She squinted toward the window. "I saw that sag." "You've got a good eye for angles." "My uncle was a cooper," he said, brushing wood dust from his arms. "Taught me how to level by feel before he taught me to shoot." Kenzie looped the sling through her fingers and stood. "You ever think about taking in an apprentice?" "Someone to learn the trade?" "I did once," he said, voice quieter now. "Back when I thought I'd be passing something along." She didn't press. Instead, she crossed to the hearth and hung the new sling from a nail to dry. "Sadie's going to need a place to learn things. Not just how to survive, but how to make something last. That's not easy to come by out here." "No," she said, "but it's easier with more than one set of hands." He stepped closer, not touching her, not leaning in, just standing where she could see him, steady as the doorframe behind him. "You've got plans for that other cabin?" "I went to look at it this morning," she said. "While you were down by the creek. It's rough, but it's sound. I could see where a stove might go. You'd need help hauling stone for a new hearth." "I was hoping you'd offer." Their eyes met, and the quiet between them shifted, less like a pause, more like a held breath. "I'd rather build something with you," Rhett said, "than hand it off to someone else." Kenzie blinked, slow and solemn. "I'm not afraid of being alone." "But I'm tired of it." "You don't have to be." She took a step closer, the fire reflecting off her eyes, not bright but lit with something steady. "If I stay, it won't be because I need saving." He reached for her hand, rough palm closing around fingers still marked from sewing. "I know." Sadie let out a soft sigh from the cot behind them, turning in her sleep. Neither of them looked away. "I want to earn the life I have next," Kenzie said. "Not just survive it. We can build it together," Rhett said. She didn't answer with words, just leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. He folded his arms around her, slow and sure, like settling into something meant. Outside, the wind stirred the trees but didn't bite. Inside, the warmth held. The cabin wasn't quiet anymore, it breathed with them, with the weight of shared days and the shape of something new, growing between them like roots below frost. The thaw came slow, the earth softening beneath the snow in patches, dark and wet and promising. Days stretched longer and the wind lost its bite. The trees had not leafed yet, but their branches no longer groaned with cold. Rhett and Kenzie worked with the rhythm of people who no longer needed to speak. Every task aloud, he brought down old boards from the eaves, and she steadied the ladder without asking. She hauled empty buckets from the creek, and he met her halfway with a hand and a quiet nod. They had begun clearing the ground behind the second cabin, the one Kenzie had laid claim to with her eyes more than her voice. Rhett had patched the roof with split shakes and tar, and Kenzie had dug a trench for the stove pipe, her palms blistered by noon and wrapped by evening. On one of those clear days, Kenzie tied a scarf around Sadie's hair and let her toddle between the cabins, her steps careful but determined. Rhett carved a small wooden horse for her, smooth and simple, and Sadie took to it like it had always been hers. Kenzie watched from the stoop, arms wrapped around her knees as Rhett set a post in the corner of the garden and tamped the soil firm. "She's not afraid anymore," she said. Rhett glanced up. "She shouldn't have to be." Kenzie rested her cheek on her arm. "I think maybe I'm not either." He didn't answer with words but came to sit beside her, the sunlight just catching in his hair. They watched Sadie press the toy into the dirt and babble to herself, the sounds bright and untroubled. Kenzie turned her head toward him. You ever think about what it'd be like having a family of your own? He shrugged lightly. I used to, then I stopped letting myself. Her voice stayed even. Why? Didn't seem like the kind of thing I could make last. Kenzie looked at him, really looked. You've made a home that held the worst of the winter. You've carved a child a horse with your own hands. You think that's not building something? He met her eyes. I didn't expect you, or her. But we're here, he nodded. You are. She leaned into him, shoulder to shoulder. I've been thinking, she said quietly. That other cabinet's got good bones, but I don't want to sleep under a different roof every night, not when there's one already warm. He turned to face her fully. You sure? Kenzie's voice didn't waver. I want to build something with you. Not just a garden, not just a roof. A life. Rhett reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Then stay. I already have. They kissed then, not hurried, not soft with doubt, but with the certainty of two people who'd walked through cold and grief and hunger and still found each other whole. The kind of kiss that didn't need promises because everything was already understood. That night, Rhett moved his cot to the far wall and cleared a space beside the hearth. Kenzie spread Sadie's blanket there and Rhett laid down his own beside it. They didn't speak much, just undressed in the quiet, folded their worn clothes and slipped beneath the quilt together, her back against his chest, his hand over hers. Spring pressed in through the cracks, not all at once, but in steady warmth. The stove didn't burn through the night anymore, and the mornings smelled of wet dirt and pine. Kenzie planted her carrots and onions in the space behind Rhett's cabin, no longer the second one, and Rhett built a bench along the porch where Sadie could sit and string wildflowers into knots too loose to last. When the hens started laying again, Kenzie collected the eggs in her apron and left one on Rhett's plate each morning, boiled and salted just the way he liked. Rhett fixed the fence along the south edge, and in the evenings they sat together with Sadie between them, watching the smoke from the chimney rise straight and steady. One Sunday, Rhett pulled a ring from his pocket, plain silver, the band a little uneven. He'd melted it down from a brooch his sister once wore, worked it smooth with a file, polished it with ash and oil. Kenzie looked at it, then at him, and smiled with something slow and deep in her chest. You think I need a ring to know I'm yours? No, he said. But I want you to have it. She slid it on her finger, kissed him once, and that was all. They built a second room onto the cabin that summer, just wide enough for Sadie to have a space of her own. Kenzie hung a piece of old lace in the window, and Rhett carved her name into the lintel. Sadie learned to say "pa" by fall, and though Rhett never corrected her, his voice always caught a little when she did. The garden gave them enough to fill 2 shelves in the root cellar. The chickens fattened and stayed safe. The cabin roof held through the next snow. Rhett never again wondered what it would be like to have something last. Because every morning, when the sun filtered in through the eastern pane, and Kenzie rolled toward him with sleep still in her eyes, and Sadie's bare feet padded across the boards toward the stove, he knew. They had built something, and it was good, and it would hold.